So to further discuss the evolving tensions between Jerusalem and Washington, I'm honored to be joined by former Israeli ambassador to the US and former Deputy Foreign Minister Danny Ayalon. Here with me in the studio, and in the United States, Rich Outzen, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening. So on a scale of 1 to 10, Danny, how would you evaluate Israel's current relations with the U.S., with Washington?
Well, I would say that you need to kind of split it between two fronts. One is the United States and Israel. I would say it's almost 10. And then if you look about the United States or the administration and the Israeli government, it's less than 5, unfortunately. But the United States is supporting Israel because Israel is a major asset for the United States. It's the cornerstone of the American, let's say, architecture, and certainly the new architecture in the Middle East.
But Danny, I'll speak with you about the relationship in a second, but I want to ask you whether B does not affect A, because you've said that A is nearly 10, Israel and the US, but the administrations is less than 5, and we know that people make the music.
Right, but I think that the United States supports Israel despite the government, despite Smotrich, despite Ben Gvir and all their irresponsible remarks. And this is because the United States is a superpower. They have strategic patience, and they have tolerance, and they know what's important, and they zero on what's important. What's important for them is to do away with Hamas. Hamas is a terror organization, and also they know Hamas is also in the way of the two-state solution, which is their vision. So from Israel, they want to know what's the day after, a vision. Right now, the government is not ready to do it, but when they work together with the Americans, I think that can patch up all misunderstandings.
Rich Outzen, how does it look from Washington?
I'm not sure I would say 10 out of 10, even at the popular level. I would say maybe 8 out of 10, and I'll tell you why. There's 1 out of 10, and this is somewhat new, maybe from generational change, that are on the far left, the progressive movements, people that frankly don't have the sympathy and the sense of sort of visceral connection to the state of Israel that developed for people of my generation, and at least a generation earlier than that. There are 20-somethings that frankly don't know their history very well. If you want to talk about the Holocaust or about Israel's wars of self-defense earlier, and those people are a visceral anti-Israel lobby that is frankly a new thing in the United States political spectrum. The other is, I would say there's another 1 out of 10 people who are very much friends of Israel that are worried about the long-term impacts of not having the strategy in place. The ambassador mentioned that the Netanyahu government's not ready to say what happens the day after a political strategy. Well, look, Clausewitz was the one who said that all war serves a political end. There must be a policy vision for what happens after all of this. And some of us that are very friendly with Israel and have worked with the IDF closely in the past, as I have, are a little worried about the lack of a political vision for what happens when the fighting stops. Yes, Benny Gantz is right. Hamas must be removed from the ability to do what they did on October 7th throughout the entirety of the Strip. But that has to be accompanied not just by palliative humanitarian assistance measures, but by a real political strategy for what happens next.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Well, sure. As an example, there are people that would assert, and some on the right, and frankly, I'm on the right in the United States, but some people who assert that we don't need a political strategy because all Palestinians support Hamas in Gaza, because otherwise they wouldn't be ruling in Gaza. Well, frankly, that's fallacious. I think you have to find a way to engage with people that are indifferent to Hamas or angry at Hamas, and who are, frankly, the raw material for what happens next in the Gaza Strip. Who's engaging with them? Who's empowering them? Who's thinking about how to break Hamas's patronage networks and build up networks that are more amenable to a peaceful coexistence with Israel? I don't think that thinking's being done right now, and frankly, that's part of what, as much as it pains me to give the Biden administration a little credit here. I think that's part of what's motivating them in their criticism and why they're at a 5, as the ambassador says, because they're demanding that there be some thought about how to shape that political reality post-Hamas.
So, Danny Ayalon, let's drill down. Israel wants to operate in Rafah. The U.S. opposes that. What can Israel do in order to gain the U.S. support for that very much needed operation?
Well, first of all, the United States is not categorically opposed to the operation in Rafah. They just say, before you do it, show us a plan that you protect the civilians and, with humanitarian corridors and all that. I think the most important thing to convince the Americans to be on the same page as us is to show a plan for the day after. This is very important because the United States sees the day after as a segue to changing the entire architecture in the Middle East, normalization with Saudi Arabia, pushing out or not allowing in the two strategic rivals of the United States, China and Russia, and most importantly for us, isolating Iran and its proxies.
So I'll use your expertise both on the diplomatic arena and as a former politician in Israel, Danny, and I'll ask you, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is very much experienced, more than anyone else over here. He understands that he pays a huge diplomatic price. Israel pays a huge diplomatic price for a very limited political gain. Why so?
Well, I would say that unfortunately, his government and his political future at this point depends on his coalition partners, namely Smotrich and Ben Gvir. I bet the United States would have very much liked to see enlargements of the government, let's say having Yair Lapid going in, but from political, if I put my political hat now, Yoav, he knows that if he prefers Gantz, Lapid, Eisenkot on Smotrich and Ben Gvir, this could be very short-lived, that after the campaign they can leave any moment.
But on the contrary, Danny, if he prefers Smotrich and Ben Gvir, the day after will come, the day after with the administration, the day after with the Egyptians, with the Saudis, with the Europeans. Israel needs to exist.
Well, I think that he thinks that, he can kick the can down the road and
wait for Trump.
Maybe for Trump, maybe for some developments which are not foreseen now. Bibi in his, I would say, psyche or decision-making process, he prefers to make the decision at the last moment that he has to.
He always had. Rich, back to you in the U.S. So once again, the late Henry Kissinger used to say that Israel does not hold any diplomatic thinking. Everything is political in Israel. It seems nothing has changed 50 years on.
Well, I think that's right. And having lived in Israel for 4 years myself, I have an appreciation for how complicated the politics there are. But look, this is the sort of moment at war that distinguishes between statesmen and politicians. And I think statesmen are thinking, I don't want to be trite and say 2 or 3 moves down the road, but they need to have in mind what is actually feasible in the long term. And while I agree with what we've heard from the military experts as well as the political echelons in Israel, that Hamas rule cannot be left intact even in Rafah, I think there's more than one way to skin a cat. And I think you start by not waiting to have viable alternatives for humanitarian assistance and working with reasonable governance options with the Palestinians. You build that in the north while you are isolating and destroying the remnants of the Hamas fighting battalions in the south. And frankly, it's a missed opportunity that we haven't seen that already. There needs to be more vision. You can't wait until the day after to see how the politics are going to play out. The art of leadership in war means you think about your coalition internally while you're thinking about your coalition externally. And frankly, the United States is part of that, and we're demanding some strategic coherence from our partner. Yes, there's a tremendous sympathy, and there will be continued support from the United States, but we also have a right to demand that there's some responsible strategic thinking.
And furthermore, Mr. Outzen, the Biden administration and Biden himself paid a tremendous price for Israel within the Democratic Party. And when it comes to Trump, we've heard him even this week saying that if he gets back to office, to the Oval Office, for example, he won't give money to foreign entities. He just give loans, etc., etc. So nobody promises Israel that under a new Trump administration, life would be better.
Yeah, well, so Trump is all about the art of the deal. I mean, he wrote about that a long time ago, and he thinks first and foremost about the well-being of U.S. taxpayers, and he wants a good deal for U.S. taxpayers. And frankly, while he's a big fan of Israel and has close personal ties to Israel, he won't let the United States taxpayer foot the bill for an extended debacle brought about by bad strategic planning. He'll be a hard friend. And so I think if kicking the can down the road is a product of thinking that that'll be okay with Donald Trump, I think some people are going to need to rethink that strategy.
So if you were to advise the Israeli Prime Minister, the Israeli government, Rich, what would you say? What would you tell them?
Well, so I would say that the time is now to develop a parallel strategy, a political strategy, not for internal Israeli politics, but the political strategy for what is going to exist in Gaza when this fighting stops. I think it's clear that Israel needs to and is, in fact, destroying the military capabilities of Hamas in the Strip. Whether that's done 100%, 90%, 80%, I mean, it's really hard with these sorts of movements to extirpate every last person who wants to fight against you. But what has been done is the disruption and really making impossible for them to exert control. That won't last forever. There's a vacuum in Gaza now. That vacuum has to be filled by a forward-looking Israeli strategy that identifies the Palestinians you can work with, the types of aid that needs to flow in now, and the restoration of services and a trusted network of Palestinians who can work with Israel for security, for service provision, for humanitarian assistance. Build that now and get it in now. If you wait until every last Hamas fighter is dead, then you're just going to restart this whole cycle with a bunch of people that never got the services and never had an opportunity for a reset with Israel.
Danny Ayalon, same question to you. What would you advise the Israeli government?
I certainly agree with the Colonel Outzen. I think we do need to make very, very tough decisions and to strategize. If we do not strategize, if there is a vacuum, then somebody else will decide for us. If Israel wants to secure the Gaza area, we need to make sure that there is a new regime. I would say that an interim, probably a long interim period, where I would see a triangle where Israel is responsible for security, Egypt administration, and Saudi Arabia maybe and the Emirates for the economy. I think this could lead the way into a new and revitalized Palestinian Authority, which would not support terror, which would not support the curriculum that hates Israel, stop financing terror, and change the political culture. I think Israel has the wherewithal to do it if we plan ahead.
One last question to both of you. We see a rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism and anti-Zionism, mainly in the U.S. What would you do, Danny, if you were currently the Israeli ambassador in the U.S.? Can anything be done?
Oh, certainly. I think the government of Israel, Israelis could do much better PR. If we show, who we are dealing with, they are kidnapping babies. There's still a baby, Kfir Bibas, a 1-year-old baby that they held hostage. What they did with the raping, what they do with elderly people, not even giving them what they need in terms of their medication. I think this is, when you talk about humanitarian situation, this is what should be pointed out. And again, I agree with the Colonel that Israel's American support for Israel is slipping because we're not showing the facts.
Colonel Outzen, what would you say?
Well, we live in a postmodern, or maybe even a post-postmodern world, and many of the same people working in the United States to demonize and delegitimize the state of Israel and Israel's self-defense have frankly been hard at work trying to delegitimize the form of government, the constitutional form of government that the United States has, by saying that we are a white supremacist and settler colonialist nation. It's ironic in the grand historical scope that they make the same sorts of arguments against both countries. I think the ambassador's right. I think that the PR is part of this and presentation of facts, which, by the way, I'm in Washington, but when I go to New York, I have seen in many places pictures of the hostages. I've seen people getting involved and taking the risks of having people conduct anti-Semitic slurs or insults at them. I think, broadly speaking, there's courage to make that argument here, but we're dealing with a massive amount of disinformation and misinformation. And frankly, as much as it's PR, it's also just everybody engaging in the virtual spaces and in their personal lives on the basis of empirical facts. You have people in this world that want to kill the innocent and consider that virtue. And that argument needs to be made every day by people of good faith.
Reach Outzen in Washington. Danny Ayalon here with me in the studio. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us tonight.